This time on the deep dive, we're looking at something that's, well, frankly, terrifying. Asbestos in UK schools.
Yeah, it's one of those issues that might not seem like a big deal at first glance, but when you really dig into it, it's really quite alarming.
And that's what we're here for, to do that digging. The Daily Mail is calling this a tsunami of asbestos-related deaths waiting to happen, potentially affecting hundreds of thousands.
And a key point here is that it's not just about the teachers and staff who've worked in these buildings for years. It's about the students, too. Children.
Right, and the numbers they're citing are pretty staggering. Since 1980, they say at least 1,400 teachers and staff and over 12,000 pupils have already died from mesothelioma.
And just to be clear, mesothelioma is a particularly nasty form of cancer that's directly linked to asbestos exposure.
So we're talking about a known carcinogen present in schools, potentially exposing millions of people. And the real kicker is this long latency period, right?
Exactly. It can take decades for symptoms to show up. You've been exposed as a child, lived your whole life, and then suddenly, bam, you're diagnosed with this aggressive cancer.
And that brings us to the big question. What's being done about it? What does the government have to say for itself?
Well, the Daily Mail is extremely critical of the government's current approach, which is basically to just leave asbestos undisturbed unless it's visibly damaged.
Which, as you can imagine, isn't exactly reassuring.
No, not at all. Because the real danger here is the asbestos fibers, which are often invisible to the naked eye. So even if a ceiling or wall looks fine, those fibers could still be getting into the air, especially in a school setting where, let's face it, things get knocked around.
So how effective can those government inspections really be if they're not actually looking for these microscopic fibers?
That's a major point the Daily Mail is raising. They argue that the government's claim that most schools are managing asbestos safely doesn't hold much water when their inspections might be missing the mark.
So what are they proposing instead? Because they're not just highlighting a problem, they're actually putting forward a pretty radical solution, right?
They are, yeah. They're calling for a national database of every single building in the UK that contains asbestos, starting with schools and hospitals and ultimately complete removal.
That's a massive undertaking, to say the least.
It is. It would be hugely expensive and logistically complex. But the question is, what's the alternative?
And to really drive home the urgency of the situation, the Daily Mail highlights some pretty heart-wrenching stories.
Yeah, they do. These personal accounts really humanize the issue, which is so important.
Like the story of Roger Tweed, a former head teacher now battling mesothelioma. It just seems incredibly unjust.
It really does. This is someone who dedicated their life to education, to kids, and now they're facing this awful disease because of a known danger lurking in the very spaces where they worked.
It's truly heartbreaking. And then there's Helen Bone, a young mother also diagnosed with mesothelioma. Her story really shows how this isn't just an old person's disease.
Exactly. It can affect anyone who spent a significant amount of time in these older school buildings. And to strengthen their case, they've included insights from several experts.
Right. They've got quotes from lawyers specializing in asbestos litigation, which kind of speaks for itself.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It suggests that this is not just a health crisis, but a potential legal nightmare waiting to happen. And they've also got quotes from health officials and Liz Darlison, the CEO of Mesothelioma UK.
And she doesn't mince words. She calls the continued presence of asbestos in schools a national disgrace.
Strong words, but given what we're learning, it's hard to argue with her assessment. This is a serious issue that demands a serious response. And the government's response to the Daily Mail's report is, well, let's just say they're not exactly on the same page. But more on that in a bit.
So they're basically saying, look, we get it. Removing all asbestos would be a huge undertaking, but our current plan is working, and it's the most sensible way to manage the risk.
Yeah, that's their stance. They argue that completely eradicating asbestos from every school is just not realistic, at least not without causing major disruptions and blowing the budget.
And of course, they're quick to point out that there's no need to panic.
Right. They emphasize that the vast majority of schools are managing asbestos responsibly and that the risks to pupils and staff are very low as long as those materials are in good condition and undisturbed.
But that's kind of a big if, isn't it? I mean, we've already talked about how these fibers are often invisible. So how can they be so sure everything is truly contained in every school?
Exactly. And that's the crux of the Daily Mail's argument. They say the government is relying on a system that's built on wishful thinking rather than a comprehensive understanding of where asbestos actually is and what state it's in.
And this is where that national database comes in, right?
Exactly. The Daily Mail argues that without a centralized, detailed record of every single asbestos-containing material in every single school, the government is essentially flying blind. They're relying on reports from individual schools, which may or may not be entirely accurate or up to date.
So it boils down to a fundamental disagreement over the best way to handle a known danger. Cautious management versus proactive removal.
Precisely. And it's a debate with huge implications. We're talking about the health and safety of millions of children and adults.
Yeah.
It's not something to be taken lightly. And look, it's important to acknowledge that there are valid points on both sides of this issue.
Right. It's not a black and white situation. Complete removal would be incredibly expensive and logistically challenging. But then again, can we really put a price on preventing future cases of mesothelioma, especially when we know how devastating this disease is?
Exactly. And that's where the human cost comes back into play. Because behind all the policy debates and statistical models, there are real people whose lives have been irreversibly changed by asbestos exposure.
And the Daily Mail makes sure we don't forget that, which I appreciate. They share some truly heartbreaking stories from families who've been directly impacted by this issue.
Yeah, like the story of Jill Phillips, who lost her husband, a former teacher, to mesothelioma a few years ago. She talks about how he was never even warned about the potential dangers of asbestos in his school.
That was just tragic, and it makes you wonder how many more families are out there completely unaware of the risks they might be facing.
And that's what makes this whole debate so frustrating.
Yeah.
Because it often feels like we're stuck in this reactive cycle, only addressing the problem after it's already claimed another victim.
Instead of, taking proactive steps to prevent it from happening in the first place.
Exactly. And that's really the heart of the Daily Mail's message, isn't it? They're urging us to learn from the mistakes of the past and to finally take decisive action to protect future generations.
It really makes you think about the bigger picture, right? Like, how did we get to a point where something as hazardous as asbestos is still lurking in so many schools?
It's a complex issue with a long and, frankly, quite troubling history. For decades, asbestos was hailed as this wonder material, used in everything from insulation to floor tiles. And it wasn't until the health risks became impossible to ignore that it was finally banned. But by then, the damage was already done.
So are we basically stuck with this legacy of asbestos, just trying to manage it as best we can?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The Daily Mail would argue that we can't afford to just sit back and hope for the best, that we need to be proactive, invest in removal, and really prioritize the health and safety of everyone who steps foot in these schools.
Which, of course, is easier said than done. As we've discussed, complete removal would be a logistical nightmare and incredibly expensive.
Absolutely. It would require a massive coordinated effort and significant financial resources. But then again, as the Daily Mail points out, how do you put a price tag on a life? On preventing future cases of mesothelioma?
Right. It's a question of priorities, isn't it? And this is where things get really tricky, because there's no easy answer. It's about weighing the costs and benefits, considering the scientific evidence, and ultimately making a judgment call about what level of risk we're willing to accept.
Exactly. And this is where that critical thinking we talked about earlier comes into play. It's about cutting through the noise, recognizing that there are valid points on both sides of the debate, and forming your own informed opinion.
So where does that leave us? I think, at the very least, this deep dive has highlighted the importance of awareness. Knowing about the potential dangers of asbestos, understanding the risks, and advocating for your own health and the health of your loved ones.
I completely agree. Knowledge is power, as they say. And the more we know about the risks, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions and push for change.
Absolutely. Whether it's supporting calls for a national database, demanding greater transparency from schools and the government, or simply educating yourself and your family about asbestos and its dangers, every little bit helps. Because at the end of the day, this is about more than just asbestos. It's about creating a safer, healthier environment for everyone.
Well said. And on that note, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll catch you next time.